So what's so special about Clydebank then?
Well, it's got a long history.
Wasn't it just built about 100 years ago?
You're thinking of the borough, which celebrated its centenary in 1986. But this area's been important for a lot longer than that, you know. Come on, I'll show you.
Okay.
That's the reason Clydebank's important. The river. Think about it. How did Clydebank get its name?
Wasn't it something to do with the shipyards?
That's right, Rosalie. In 1871, J&G Thompson moved their Clydebank shipyard here and the town sprang up around it. There's more to the name than that. Thompson's moved here because of the river and the land surrounding it, and that's why people have been coming to this whole area since the Ice Age. First with small groups leading a sort of seasonal life, making their way from one place to the next, hunting and fishing and gathering food. They'd pass through here on their way along the Clyde Valley, up the west coast, or across to the east coast. About 5,000 years ago, people began to settle down and use the land. You can still see the remains of some of their tombs and cairns. They also left behind some mysterious rock carvings like these.
What do they mean?
I can say. They've been found in lots of rock outcrops in the area. Some kind of ritual, sort of social sign, a game. I can't tell. But why should we? What do these people make of this? You know, when they were building this bypass in the 30s, they found a cemetery with a series of tombs and graves, which archaeologists found had been used for over 1,000 years. The excavators eventually found a series of rings of wee holes in the ground, which had been used to hold stakes and posts. And they assumed this was some kind of temple, like a mini Stonehenge. The discovery and reconstruction of this Druid's temple aroused great excitement. On just one day, almost 200,000 people came to see it. Artifacts from the site were even put on show in San Francisco. But it was all a bit controversial. They seem to have got a bit carried away. Today, archaeologists think that the holes are all that remained of fences used to hold in soil for building round barrows.
Was it the kind with the ball instead of a wheel?
Bronze Age burial mounds that were ploughed away over centuries, leaving just the stake holes. Anyway, you'll be glad to know that around 3,000 years ago, iron working was introduced. People also started to build more substantial structures, partly for defence. That hill over there, on the Kilpatricks, is called Sheep Hill. It's got the remains of an Iron Age hill fort on it, making use of the natural defences. These would be places of strength which people either lived in or used as a refuge in time of trouble, you know, the sort of thing.
We're not going up there, I hope.
No, but we could go and see a cranog.
What on earth is a crannog?
You'll find out when we get there, as long as it's low tide. A cranog is an artificial island made of rocks and timber piles with a timber platform, and it would have huts and palisades and possibly a small jetty.
You tried to say that people actually lived in the river then?
Oh yeah. Cranogs are one of the most common type of early dwelling in Scotland. They seem to have been built for over 3,000 years, right up to the Middle Ages. Although most of the ones we know about date from 2,000 years ago, including the ones in the Clyde. There was another near Old Kilpatrick and several up and down both banks.
What happened to the huts then?
Well, these timbers are over 2,000 years old. They're preserved because they're underwater most of the time. At low tide, the mud keeps them waterlogged so the air can't get in them. Anything above the waterline would have decayed long ago.
But why would people want to live in the river?
Well, to understand that, we've got to look at the way the river's developed since these times. We see it as a boundary between north and south, which can only be crossed with bridges or tunnels. But until the 18th century, it was still in its natural state. It hadn't been developed at all. It was much wider and shallower than it is now. And you could ford it here at Dumbuck, where there was a great big sandbank in several places upstream. In this landscape, where there were lots of small islands which must already have been in use, and the waters of the Clyde would regularly overflow their banks, Canoes made sense. Living on the river kept enemies, wild animals and vermin away, but the most important factor of all was the way people lived within this landscape and their need for ready access to the river. Over the years, dugout canoes and small boats of many periods have been found preserved in the mud of the Clyde, and with marshland and dense woodland along its banks, the river was probably the quickest way of getting around. It was also an incredibly rich source of food, well stocked with everything from shellfish to salmon. The regular spacing of the Canoes up and down the river suggests that a particular group's territory would centre on their stretch of river. Living on the Canoe, they could assert their claim on the river, control river traffic, and remain in easy reach of their fishing platforms and traps. This also meant that they weren't wasting good agricultural land, and they could get to their lands on both sides of the river.
I suppose there's some sense in that.
By the time the Romans arrived, these people were part of a tribe known as the Damnonii, Britons who spoke an early form of Welsh.
The Romans in Clydebank?
Of course. For some time, Clydebank was, after all, the northwest frontier of the Roman Empire. It stretched to North Africa and Persia. Come on, I'll show you a Roman fort.
I thought you said it wasn't far away.
It's not. This is it. Old Kilpatrick bus garage lies right on top of the site of the westernmost fort on the Antonine Wall. If you don't believe me, you can go to the Hunterian Museum and see the altar to Jupiter that turned up in 1969. Antoninus was Hadrian's successor as emperor, and like him, he built a great wall to divide Roman territory from the native tribes. Except this one was further north, on the line of the Forth and the Clyde, which was shorter and nearer to the Highland tribes, who were causing trouble. Unlike Hadrian's wall, this one was built of earth and turf, which is partly why there's not quite so much of it left. Even so, the bits that can still be seen show that its construction was no minor task, and the legions commemorated their efforts in stone tablets, known as distance slabs. This one, showing victory reclining, was put up by the 20th Legion, possibly at the very end of the wall's 37 miles on the Clyde just past Old Kilpatrick. This one, found at Golden Hill, near Duntoka, was put up by the 2nd Augustan Legion. Golden Hill was one of the smallest forts on the wall, but even this had its own bathhouse, from which this ornamental waterspout was recovered. You can get a good idea of what this would have been like from the bathhouse found at Bearsden, one of the other small forts on the wall. The Romans took bathing pretty seriously. They went through a series of hot and cold baths. Environmental evidence from the latrine block here showed that the soldiers' diet was almost vegetarian. It was certainly pretty varied, including raspberries, strawberries and figs, along with the opium poppy and coriander seeds for flavouring bread. The wall itself was built mainly to control movement, particularly to stop raiding parties from the northern tribes plundering Roman territory. The northern boundary of the lands of the Damnonii and other friendly tribes would have been the actual frontier, but the wall was the official customs barrier, where goods passing in and out of the empire would have been taxed at around 12.5%.
Sort of like an early Berlin Wall then?
Something like that. Certainly didn't stay in use any longer than the Berlin Wall. Faced with pressures elsewhere in the empire, the Romans withdrew to the line of Hadrian's Wall after about 25 years. They kept a presence in Scotland and probably kept up alliances with the southern tribes. When Rome finally abandoned Britain in the 5th century, the territory of the Damnonia had evolved into a strong British kingdom. centred here at Dumbarton, which they called Alt Clwyd, the Rock on the Clyde. This kingdom, which came to be known as Strathclyde, once stretched all the way from Loch Lomond to Cumbria. These were violent times, and the Strathclyde Britons had to face continual threats from their warlike neighbours, the Picts in the north, Dalriada, the expanding kingdom of the Scots who'd crossed over from Ireland, and the Angles in the southeast. Despite many bloody battles with these peoples, Alt Clwyd remained unconquered. Took the Vikings to manage that.
The Vikings?
Oh, yeah. In 873, two great armies led by the Norse king of Dublin, Olaf the White, and Ivar One-Leg, the Norse conqueror of York, successfully besieged the rock and laid waste to the surrounding countryside. The Britons of Strathclyde never really recovered. And eventually, when the last king, Owen the Bald, died, it became part of the United Kingdom of the Scots and the Picts. However, the rock continued to be an important stronghold throughout the Middle Ages. During the Wars of Independence, Sir William Wallace was captured by the Sheriff of Dumbarton and held here before being sent to his gory execution in England.
I suppose you're going to try and tell me Mary Queen of Scots spent the night here as well?
As a matter of fact, as a young girl, Mary lived here for nearly a year before sailing off to France to marry the Dauphin. And Dumbarton was one of the last castles to be held for her after defeat at Langside. The Covenanters refortified the castle against Montrose in the 17th century, and its defences were updated again during the Napoleonic Wars. Dumbarton Rock even saw service in World War II. And yet, its very name, taken from the Scots Gaelic, Fortress of the Britons, signifies the extinction of Alt Clwyd and the Kingdom of Strathclyde. Well, at least until local government was reorganised in 1976. What kind of bird that is. Throughout the Middle Ages, both Dumbarton and all of Clydebank district lay in the area known as the Lennox. The family of the Earls of Lennox, to which the ill-fated Lord Darnley belonged, was one of the most powerful in Scotland. Another important local family were the Colquhouns, who built the castle at Dunglass near Old Kilpatrick. Loch Humphrey is named after a certain Humphrey de Colquhoun. Until the 19th century, the biggest settlement in the area we now know as Clydebank District was Old Kilpatrick, where there may have been a church since early Christian times. In 1227, Malcolm, Earl of Lennox, granted this church and the parish land surrounding it to Paisley Abbey. This was bitterly disputed by later earls, understandable at a time when land and fishing rights were the only real form of wealth. These rights were often very ancient and relatively obscure. The people of Old Kilpatrick, for instance, had a long-running dispute over the watch meal they were bound to provide for the Sheriff of Dumbarton Castle.
You mean that to give him his tea?
Not quite. They had to give him a certain quantity of grain every year. Anyway, land was the most important thing for the next few hundred years. With the Reformation, the family of Claude Hamilton gained possession of the lands of Paisley Abbey, which included most of what is now Clydebank District.